Hey, what's up guys? It's Lucas and you're watching Fine Tuning, and I thought we might try something a little bit different today in the interest of keeping it fresh. So I've seen a lot of YouTubers, big guitar channels, talking about using smaller gauge strings and how they think they might have been using too heavy a gauge string for a long time. And I thought, that might apply to me. It might be worth checking out because for the better part of like maybe 15 years or something, I've been playing guitar for about 17 years, but for the better part of about 15 of those years, I've been using mostly 11 gauge strings. I have an example of that here. That would be like Ernie Ball's Power Slinky set, which is 11 to 48. So that's a pretty common 11 type string gauge. That's my standard kind of control thing. I know exactly what those feel and sound like. And let's compare that to something incredibly light, which is the Dunlop Billy Gibbons set. This is the 7 to 38 set. So I've got a set of 7s on this right now. This is my 1977 Greco EG800. It's a Japanese Les Paul copy that I absolutely love. It has Planet Tone pickups in it. This is a Planet Tone full throttle bridge and a 78 Pasadena neck. So if you like the way the guitar sounds, you want to check these pickups out, I'll leave a link in the description. But what I'm going to do is play a few different riffs and some different stuff and on the 7s, and then I will change the strings back to 11s, which is what I would usually use. And then I'll do that same kind of thing and I'll put them back to back so that we can compare the sound. And then after that, I will kind of just give you my overall thoughts, like what's the advantage to either one? Does one work better than the other? Like what's the difference? So anyway, let's get into it. We'll start with just some sound examples. All right, so let's talk about my observations and I'll give you my final thoughts. So we'll start with playability. So sevens are, of course, much easier to bend and much easier to push down into the fret. They're just very, very low tension strings, and they're really small, so that, I mean, it takes very little effort to do that. 11s seem to hold the pitch more closely after you pick the string, so you may notice that when you pick a string, the note will go just a little bit sharp and then it'll kind of settle back into the fundamental note. But 11s, because they have more tension, they have less give, so they kind of can't go as sharp. And bigger strings, tighter tension, they also have a smaller ellipsis, the travel of the string. And so it just physically can't go as sharp with the same amount of force. Sevens require a much softer attack from the pick and also a much softer push with your fretting hand. So if you're like me and you're used to a bigger gauge string, it's going to feel like you're just pushing the strings all over the place with sevens. So you want to pick pretty lightly, just enough to get the job done. And you also want to push very softly with your fretting hand, because if you push too hard, even with short frets like the Greco has, what you'll end up doing is kind of pushing the string out of tune. So you just very, very lightly touch it with both hands. The 11s can be played softly, or you can hit them hard with no kind of real change in performance. So that's kind of a benefit there. So if you want to push down really hard into the fret, you can pretty much do that. Or if you want to really dig into it with your right hand or your picking hand, you can really do that too. But if you want to push lightly, as long as you're making contact with the fret, that's still fine. If you want to pick lightly, you can still do that. No problem there. Sevens necessitate both less tension in the truss rod, because it's putting less tension on the neck, but also a higher action. Maybe not a ton higher, but higher, or they'll buzz. And the reason for that is because a smaller string like that has less tension on it, and therefore the ellipsis of the string is larger. And so the space underneath the string, between the string and the fret, has got to be bigger because that travel is bigger, or otherwise you'll get like string slap, string buzz. So you kind of trade off a little bit lower action for an easier bend, if that makes sense. 11s require more tension on the truss rod, duh, because you're putting more tension on the neck. But you can also lower the action a little bit because the string path is tighter, it's smaller. So, basically it's kind of a balancing, like the bigger the string, the lower the action, but the harder it is to bend. Sevens were easier for me to what I call side buzz. So that would be like if I'm playing a chord and the tip of my finger that's fretting one note kind of reaches over and touches another string that's being played. It's so sensitive that it was easier for me to kind of actually buzz one of those notes out a little bit. That's just a technique thing, but that is easier for me to do that. So, but they do require a lot less effort to push down. So again, kind of a trade-off there. 11s are considerably harder to fret, particularly with open string chords, like the lower down the neck, the closer to the nut you get, they're harder to push down. But they also feel a little bit more sturdy under my fingers. And what I mean by that is, like, if you've ever been playing a song and you're in the band and you kind of like fret the chord mostly right, but like maybe you're kind of on a fret a little bit or something, you can sort of, with a bigger set of strings, you can kind of like adjust the position of your hand a little bit as you're still playing the chord and you'll be okay. You can't do that with sevens. Like, you got to be accurate, because if you move even the tiniest little bit with the sevens, it's going to pick it up because it's so sensitive. Now, I will say that both sets of strings hold pitch very well, so they stay in tune really, really well. As far as like just the string and the tuner open, it stays in tune. Though I will say that 11s seem to get in tune a little quicker. So the string stretch that everybody experiences, like 11s seem to go through that quicker. That's not a huge thing. I just felt like it was worth mentioning. All right, so let's talk about the sound difference. And I found this kind of interesting. So I noticed this as I was playing it, but then after I went back and listened the next day with fresh ears, I could kind of still pick out the same thing. So that tells me there's some accuracy to this. So first, I would say 7s have noticeably less bass than the comparable 11 gauge string. So, and they also make the guitar resonate less. So like the amount of vibration that's being transferred through the bridge and the nut into the wood, you know. So the lack of bass, or I want to say lack of bass, the bass roll-off that happens with 7s, it really puts a heavy emphasis on the upper, middle, and treble frequencies of the guitar. So this may or may not be desirable to you depending on your amp setup. But I kind of liken the bass cut to like using a tube screamer. Like if you had the gain off and the level set at unity, so it wasn't like boosting it, it was just cutting off the bass. That's kind of what it feels like. It's sort of like a tightening effect almost. With 7s, I felt like I lost a good bit of the natural guitar sustain, like just the woody ringing sound of the guitar. So I felt like I kind of lost some of that. So you may want to compensate with more gain, volume, some compression, something like that. Now with the 11s, I had what I thought was definitely like a noticeable increase in bass response compared to the 7s, which kind of like thickens up the tone. And it also sort of softens the brighter upper frequencies, because when you have all those frequencies happening together and they're all kind of compressing together in the amp, the bass frequencies kind of start to take a little bit more space, and it sort of rounds off the top frequencies a little bit. So I noticed that particularly with big chords. Also, the unwound strings on 11s seem to keep up a little bit better with the wound strings as far as volume is concerned. So 6-string chords felt just more balanced to me, like I could hear all of the notes equally well on clean or drive. Whereas the 7s to me, particularly on drive settings, I felt like it kind of favored the wound strings. So like if you played a 6-string bar chord, you would hear more of the E, A, and D strings than you would the G, B, and E strings, high E strings. You could probably compensate for that with some amp settings, and you're playing with your pickup height and your technique and stuff like that. I just felt like it was worth mentioning. So the big one for me with 7s is that, and I kind of mentioned this before, is that it doesn't make the guitar resonate very much. To my ears, it sounds almost like I'm playing the pickup and the amp and not the strings, you know, if that makes sense. That's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just a different approach. Now 11s, on the other hand, I think could probably be too much for some amp setups. So if you have an amp that has really low headroom in the preamp or the power amp, either one, or just like a smaller speaker or something, like 11s might push it too hard. It might get fuzzy and muddy and not nice sounding. So bigger strings are definitely louder for sure, and to me they have just more bass, just thicker sound. Not that one is better, just different. All right, so here's the final verdict to me. Bigger strings equal louder, bigger tone, but they are harder to play. Lighter strings, smaller, thinner tone, but they are easier to play. So I went with real extremes here, going from 7s to 11s. I mean, there's all kinds of gauges in between that and hybrids and stuff. So I would say you just got to weigh out, you know, all of the components of your rig, the guitar, the pickups, the amp, how loud you're playing, how much gain you're using, all that stuff, and kind of find what works for you. But for me, 7s are just too light. Like, I just felt like I was losing all the natural sound of the guitar. But again, that's just personal preference. I'd love to know what you guys think in the comments. I'm going to give a set of these to my dad and see what he thinks, because he generally plays like 9s or something most of the time. So I'll be curious to see what he thinks about 7-gauge strings, because that should be light even for him. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments, if you heard the differences or what you thought. And until next time, I'll catch you later.